This is Yair Davidiy, speaking to you from the land of Israel. I represent Brit-Am. Our organisation studies the whereabouts of the lost 10 tribes. We find the lost 10 tribes amongst Western nations. Not only do we find the lost 10 tribes amongst Western peoples, but also, to a significant degree, we can determine which tribes went where, and where their descendants are probably to be found in our time. And we find, amongst other things, that the Israelite tribe of Gad became prominent in the land of Sweden, amongst the Swedish peoples. Also, they were present amongst the Ancient Goths, and the Ancient Goths gave rise to the Swedes themselves. So this is what we're about to discuss, this is what we are going to explain. And in this particular lecture, in this particular lesson, we are going to concentrate upon rabbinical sources and showing how rabbinical sources describing, analysing the tribal traits of the tribe of Gad are reflected in the Swedish character. And perhaps you yourself are descended from Gad or know someone who is. At all events, these studies help us understand the differences between different peoples. They help us understand something about ourselves, about our neighbours, about members of our families, and also help us to develop tolerance for other people who are different from us, who think differently from us, who have different approaches to us. But all of them have something to give to the world. All of them have a place in civilization, in this entity of mankind, in this complex of humanity that we deal with. And we are concentrating here upon the lost 10 tribes. The lost 10 tribes were a section of the tribes of Israel. In ancient times there were 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 tribes of Israel divided into two different sections. The southern section headed by the tribe of Judah, but also with the tribe of Benjamin and Levi and others. From the other tribes, they together comprise the present-day Jewish people. Most of the Israelite nation had separated. They established their own kingdom, headed by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and after him became other kings, and they had their own country, their own independent kingdom to the north of Judah. And eventually the Assyrians came down and conquered the land of the northern tribes, of the 10 tribes, and took all of them away into exile. They exiled all of them, and in their places of exile they lost awareness of where they came from, of who they are. Even before their exile, they'd been in effect pagans and distanced themselves very much from the traditions of Israel, from the religions of Israel. So even more so under the influence of other peoples and the exigencies of survival, they forgot who they are, as did every other nation in ancient times. Everyone forgot who they are and where they came from. So this is what we have, but nevertheless, the 10 tribes historically, they went to certain areas. They went to specific places, and we could trace after them through historical studies and other researchers, and also through biblical indications, biblical prophecies, supplemented by rabbinical explanations and commentaries which based on the Bible, which help us understand the Bible and put everything in place. And we are able to locate specific tribes in certain areas. And one of these areas is Sweden. Scandinavia in general belongs to the lost 10 tribes, or has members of the lost 10 tribes amongst its inhabitants. And Sweden specifically is a place of the tribe of Gad, even though descendants of Gad are as minority numbers are also present in other areas. So let us get on with the subject and begin our explanation. The tribe of Gad, Gad and Asher were the two sons of Zilpah. Zilpah was the handmaiden of Zilpah was the handmaiden of Leah. Leah was the wife of Jacob. Jacob had 4 wives. He had his 2 main wives were Leah and Rachel. After that came the handmaiden of Leah, Zilpah, and the handmaiden of Rachel, Bilhah. So Zilpah was the handmaiden of Leah. From Leah Yaakov. Yaakov is another name for Israel. The name Yaakov was changed to Israel. From Leah, Yaakov begat Gad and Asher. Gad and Asher were full brothers. They were the sons of Zilpah, the handmaiden of Leah, wife of Jacob. And there the Israelites increased and multiplied. They went down into Egypt, and after that they were oppressed in Egypt, and they came out of Egypt, wandered through the wilderness and came to the land. And as they were approaching the land, the first areas they came to were the regions east of the Jordan River, the regions that were then ruled by Amorite kings, kings of the Amorites. The Amorites were a Canaanite nation, and the two kings had separate kingdoms, Og and Sihon, and these areas were conquered. After they had been conquered, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, since they had much livestock, they came to Moses and they requested that these lands be given unto him, that they receive the area, because it's good pasture land. And Moses said, okay, he agreed, but on condition that they continue with the rest of the Israelites to conquer what remained of the land to be conquered west of the Jordan, and after that come back and take their land. So they then proposed that they build fortresses for their children, they build fortresses for their wives and children, and the men folk would continue with the rest of the Israelites in the conquest, and this was agreed to. So they received their portions east of the Jordan, and also in addition to Gad and Reuben who had made the request, there was added onto them the half-tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh was divided into two sections. One section was east of the Jordan together with Gad and Reuben. In the Bible he's referred to the half-tribe of Manasseh. Another section of Manasseh was west of the Jordan, north of Ephraim. When Gad was born, Genesis 30 verses 9 onwards, it tells us, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, a troop comes. In Hebrew, a troop is Gad, is Gedud. And so she said, a troop comes, so she called his name Gad, from Gedud, as if a troop, a large number of people, a band of warriors, actually. Gad was predicted in this prophecy that Gad would become a band of warriors. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, am I happy, for the daughters will call me blessed? So she called his name Asher. And after that we have the sons of Gad, Ziphion and Hagi, Shuni and Esbon, Eri and Arodi and Hareli. You see Genesis 46:16. And we have other sons of Gad, and these sons became the heads of important clans, most of whom were to be found later in Scandinavia. And they too became entities in their own right, historical entities that we have records of, and that confirm our identifications. When Moses died, he blessed Gad. He said of Gad, see in Deuteronomy 33, chapter 33, verses 20-21, he said of Gad, he said, blessed is he who enlarges Gad. He dwells as a lion, and twists the arm and the crown of his head. He provided the first part for himself, because the lawgiver's portion was reserved there. He came with the heads of the people. He administered the justice of the Lord and his judgments with Israel. From the above blessing, we see from the above blessing that Gad, he would expand his territory, would conquer other regions. Gad is likened unto a lion. His warriors strike blows that cleave both the head and the arm. They're so strong and powerful. There's using an axe, of course, an axe or a straight sword. They cleave both the head of the arm. The blows of their warriors with the sword or the straight axe have such an effect. And this shows that the sons of Gad, the offspring of Gad, were exemplary fighters, quite good in warfare. Gad, along with Reuben and half Manasseh, were the first to inherit a portion in the land. As it says, he provided the first part for himself. And then it says, because the lawgiver's portion was reserved there, because Moses was destined to be buried in the portion of Gad. And some of the commentators say that Gad knew this or intuitively felt it. And that was also one of the reasons why they wanted to dwell where they did. And this, we couldn't even make a distinction. Actually, when the tribes of Gad, Reuben came to Moses and asked for their portion east of the Jordan, they didn't say which area would go to which. And maybe out of the two areas that were possible to be given unto them, Gad had preferred that portion that later became the birthplace, that later became the burial place of Moses, because somehow or other he intuited that Moses would be buried there, and there was something special about Moses that they wanted to remain, to preserve an attachment to. So this is worth keeping in mind, these things. They're interesting, and they give us and they help us later, to understand other things. We also see here an indication that the descendants of Gad would be among the warriors who placed themselves at the disposal of David. Gad administers justice, as it says here. It says he administers the justice of the Lord in this blessing to Gad. It could be referring to Moses, but it could also at the same time be hinting at Gad, who himself dispenses justice and his judgments with Israel, because as we shall see, Sweden believes in equity, in social equality, in every person receiving his portion. And this is an aspect of the character of Gad, and it is reflected in the Swedish people. There are several verses in the Bible referring to Gad as warriors. 1 Chronicles 5:18 says the sons of Reuben, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh had 40,760 valiant men able to bear shield and sword, to shoot with a bow, and skillful in war, who went to war. Also in 1 Chronicles 12 it says 8. Some Gadites from people from the tribe of Gad joined David at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty men of valor, men trained for battle, who could handle shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and were swift as gazelles on the mountains. Also 1 Chronicles 12:14. These were from the sons of Gad, captains of the army. The last was over 100, and the greatest was over 1,000. Later we see that Gad was exiled. Gad was exiled together with the Reuben and half tribe of Manasseh, and the other tribes were exiled later. Gad was the first to be exiled, and according to one source in the Midrash, Gad will be amongst the first to be redeemed in the end times. It says in 1 Chronicles 5 verse 26, so the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He carried the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh into captivity. He took them to Hala, Habor, Hara, and the river of Gozan to this day. So it tells us where Gad was taken, and he was taken to these areas, and these areas were also those who were lost in tribes were later taken to. And they were part of the lost in tribes, and they shared the fate of the lost in tribes, and the lost in tribes lost consciousness of their ancestry, but according to biblical prophecy, they were to remain physically as they were, they were to receive the blessings and to fulfill a mission that God had placed upon the lost in tribes, to civilize the pagan peoples, to elevate themselves and to bring the world upwards with them, which to a degree they did, and we have spoken on this matter in other talks. Now we are concentrating upon the identification of Gad himself with the Swedish people. So the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half Manasseh, they dwelt in the regions known as Bashan and Gilead, east of the Jordan. The tribe of Dan was also associated with the Bashan. See Deuteronomy 33:22. It says, Dan, which will be a line leaping from the Bashan. We find Dan in Denmark, and also at one stage in southern Sweden. And it says here that Dan will be like a lion leaping from the Bashan. The Bashan in ancient times was known as Basilia or Basil. And the Roman geographer Pliny says that Scandinavia was also known as Basilia, which is the same as Basil. So here we see one of the names given to Scandinavia was the same name as that applied to the Bashan. The name Gad in biblical Hebrew could be pronounced as Goth. How do we have in Hebrew? You have letters and you have vowel signs. That is how we know how Hebrew is to be pronounced. So in modern Hebrew, it's based on the Sephardic pronunciation. We call Gad Gad. The Gimel is more or less agreed upon. The G sound is more or less agreed upon. The A sound that we have in Gad, amongst the Ashkenazim and the Yemenites, is actually pronounced as an O. And in ancient biblical Hebrew, that may be how it was pronounced, or that may be how it was pronounced among some of the tribes. Instead of A, in Gad you would say Go, O. And the D sound is what is called a dalet, a D that is not accentuated. A non-accentuated D or dalet was pronounced as th. So you have Goth. Incidentally, this thing of unaccentuated dalet Ds pronounced as th is also found in ancient Nordic languages and ancient English. The ancient English and the Scandinavians and Germanic languages in general, but had this same thing that we find in ancient Hebrew, the same point and other similar points, linguistic niceties that are worth examining and have been examined, and we have written about this, and we hope that people with more expertise than ourselves will go into this much more deeper than we have done. But the evidence is there, it is of interest. The evidence is there, it is of interest. So Gad could be called Goth. That Goth is another name for Gad. Also the historical Goths. The historical Goths were a people in ancient times. We find the Goths in Sweden. Sweden was actually divided into two different sections. There were the Sevia, or the Swedish, according to Tacitus. They were in one section of the land. Another section of the land was inhabited by people known as the Goths. And eventually the Swede and the Goths united. They created the kingdom of Sweden. The Swede or the Swedes have a name similar to that of Shuani or Suani, who was the firstborn son of Gad. He was an important clan, a segment of Gad, and the Goths themselves have a name whose name is similar to Gad. And the Goths were also had their empires of their own. They had an empire. They had the south of the Baltic Sea in what is now northern Germany and Poland. And some of them moved to the area of the Ukraine, and also they were in Hungary, also in the Balkans, other areas of the Balkans. And from there they moved to the west. They were in southern France for a while, and settled in southern France to some degree. Also they were in Spain. And we find segments of the Goths all in many different places. Now, it could be that the Goths were actually became a federation of different peoples, or from different origins. And the people who we know in history as Goths were not necessarily from the tribe of Gad. They may have been other peoples who had joined upon them, been affiliated with them, and all had to receive their name. There are other indications that the Goths became identified with the forces of Gog and Magog. So we don't know what portion of the historical Goths actually were from the original tribe of the Goths, from the original Gad. But some of them were, some of them definitely were, and they gave their name to the other peoples who were affiliated with them, and something of their character. And it could be that there were always elements from the original Goths, to the original tribe of Gad amongst the Goths. And everywhere the Goths settled, they probably left people behind them. So we find amongst the immigrants to the USA, the large number of people came from Eastern Europe and came from Central Europe and came from other areas. Many of them may have been descended from the Goths. We have such a thing as a homecoming, instinctive homecoming. People pick themselves up and move out. You have two villages, for instance, as happened in Germany and also in Italy and other places. You have two villages, one beside the other. For some reason, suddenly, not necessarily because of economic motivation, so that was an important factor. For one reason, doesn't really matter why. One village, which is located beside the other, nearly all the inhabitants of one village pick themselves up and they all move out, they all go to America, or they go to Canada, or other places, Australia such as, and whereas the other village stays where they are. And it could be that the two villages reflect different ancestries. And those who left who went to the USA could be, as are indications of the Bible, they could also all be descended from those 10 tribes coming home. And the dispersion of the Goths could have been one of the ways in which the elements from Gad been found in these regions as well as in Sweden. At all events, Sweden was a place where we identify them with a remain pure, not pure as not in an ethic sense pure, but in concentration, so they make them identifiable as they were, staying as they were. That is where we find the Goths, the ancient Goths, were to be found in Sweden, and that is also where we find the tribe of Gad giving expression to himself. So that is all these points that are worth noting, worth taking into consideration, and it opens our eyes to many historical possibilities. According to the Zohar, the animal symbol of the tribe of Gad was a goat, a Davidiy. A goat can mean a young lamb or a young goat, and the animal, the representative animal of the Goths was a goat. And the name Gad in Hebrew can also mean indicate chopping or cutting. Gedud, also groups. And also can mean a deity, an idol, a god, or something representing the god of good luck, but also God in general. This may be where the Germanic languages and other languages receive their name for the deity, the god. The name God may come from the same Hebrew root. Many words in Western languages do. And so the Goths of history, they refer to themselves as the people of God, perhaps because of this linguistic connection. There were ancient writers or writers in the early Middle Ages, such as John Mandeville, 1499, and they identified the Austrian tribes, obviously, with the Goths, with a portion of the Goths. And so there were legends and traditions that related the Goths to the Israelites. Sweden is a region, as we said, where the Goths are recognisable, where they settled, where we know for sure they settled and remained as they were, and where we can relate to them as descendants of Gad. And it was prophesied by Jacob in Genesis 14:19 that a troop overcame him, he shall overcome at the last. So Barbanel, he said this reflects on Gad. Gad would be broken up into different sections, but they would retain some type of connection between them, and they would recoalesce, reunite, and overcome their enemies. And this is what the Goths of history did on several occasions. It was a characteristic of them. So it's worth taking into cognizance this feature. As we said, there were quite a few peoples who somehow or other were connected with Gad, but we concentrate upon Sweden because that is where we can definitely identify them. Just to run through a few of the peoples who were also connected with Gad, it's of interest. As we said, God is another name for the Goths, also pronounced Gud or Gudo. The Gitai also from the Goths, a section of the Goths in the Balkans and also in Scandinavia. Guti was the name for the Goths both in Scandinavia and also in the area of Ancient Assyria, and also in the region east of the Caspian. On the Baltic coast, you had the people known as the Guthans, you had the Gotai in Scandinavia, the Gedrosia in Iran. The name Passagadoi in Aramaic, as pointed out by the history of the Persians in French by de Gobineau, he points out that the name Passagadoi, actually in Aramaic, indicated sons of Gad. So the Passagadoi were a clan amongst ancient Persians, from whom Cyrus and the rulers of Persia came. Cyrus was the one who conquered the Babylonians and let the Jews return to the land of Israel and gave them permission to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And this indicates that he too could have been from the lost tribes of Israel. It's a point of interest. And the other areas of who may also, where we also have indications that elements from Gad settled. So too with the clans of Gad. The clans of Gad gave their names to different elements in early European history. We have the Hagi, who became the Hagi, or Chauci Franks, and also the Hugu and the Hossing There was another name for these peoples, pronounced similar to Hagi. Also with the Huguenots of France. The Huguenots of France were Calvinists, Protestants in France, but who became very important in history. Many of them settled and moved to America. Others were scattered throughout Europe, but they were very important. Historically, they gave rise to a great number of distinguished people. Also, some of them settled in northern Netherlands. On the whole, the Huguenots were friendly to the Jewish people, with exceptions, and it may be that they came originally from a specific area in southern France where the Goths had been predominant, and they were named after a legendary person, a ghost called Hugo, who may reflect Hagi, one of the sons of Gad, and it's an interesting point. And we have others. We have the Arodi became the Harudi in Norway, or the Hydra Goths in Scandinavia in general, the Areli from Gad became the Haruli, the Herals, also in Sweden, associated with the Goths. And we have the Guni became the Huni, maybe the Guni of Naphtali, and so on. We have the people, this is written up in our books and in articles we have on the website. Those who are interested can look it up and see for themselves. So this is what we have. Now we come to the point about rabbinical commentary concerning the different tribes. And the rabbis, different rabbis throughout the ages wrote books. They write books all the time. The rabbis learn Torah all day long, and the books associated with the Torah and traditions about the Torah, and find points about the grammar and the different aspects of the Torah. And they come to different conclusions. They have insights that they write down. And so there's quite a literature concerning each of the tribes of Israel. It's not so easy always to dig it out, but it can be done nowadays. And some works concerning the tribes came into our provenance, came into our possession. And so we have points here brought up by different rabbis concerning the characteristics of Gad, or the tribe of Gad. We find these characteristics echoed, reflected amongst the characteristics of the people of Sweden, and this confirms our identification of the Swedish people with the tribe of Gad. So let's go through a few of these points. Rabbi Aram Alboim, and he said that Gad, he pointed out that Gad and Reuben, they volunteered to go first in conquering the land, as we see in Numbers 32:16, and they said that we will go with our brothers to conquer the land. First we will build fortresses for our children and our livestock, and we will go with you. And so they had this attribute of being brave, as other verses indicate, and not only being brave, but having the attribute of volunteering themselves to help for the public good, to help others to do what the community needs doing. And this is something we find amongst the Swedes. Also, Gad had a self-sacrificing quality of bravery. Also, we have warriors who came from Gad, the commentary who came to David, warriors from Gad who came to David, and Rashi says that each one was worth 100 of the others. And also, later they built an altar by the Jordan to ensure the acceptance of their offspring in the eyes of their kinfolk and the unity of all Israel. So what happened? They took their territories east of the Jordan. Then they helped the rest of Israel conquer their lands west of the Jordan. After the lands were conquered and divided, they returned to their homelands. They returned to the areas east of the Jordan. But after a while they came to feel themselves somewhat distant from their brothers, and they were afraid that in the course of time a gulf would develop between them and the rest of Israel. So they set up an altar by the Jordan, a gigantic altar which would serve as not for worship, but as a symbol that they too belong to the Hebrew nation. So we have this pedantic aspect of the people of Gad wanting to do what has to be done and doing more than what has to be done, and wanting to ensure their place in the assembly of Israel. And this is spoken about in the book of Joshua 22:34. It says the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, called the altar witness, that is exiled, for it is a witness between us and the Lord is God. And also, as we saw, Deuteronomy 33:21, Gad chose his portion where he knew Moses would be buried. We also have a tradition that the prophet Elisha was from the tribe of Gad. Elisha was the pupil of Eliyahu. Eliyahu himself was a Kohen from the tribe of Levi, but he was born in the area of Gad. He lived in the area of Gad. And the aspects of Eliyahu are also applicable to Gad in commentaries. And Gad will help bring the future redemption, according to Midrash. Also, Gad was a warrior. The people of Gad were known as warriors. And in World War II, Sweden was neutral. It's a tradition of being neutral, even though it has a somewhat formidable defense mechanism of its own. But in the past it was quite militant, quite bellicose. In the 1600s, Sweden engaged in numerous wars with the Poles, with the Germans, with the Prussians, with the Russians, with everyone around there. And usually they were successful. And they conquered a good deal of territory. They had a very large empire. The 1650s, their empire was the largest in Europe after Russia and Spain. Russia and Spain had larger empires, and then came the Swedes. They had the largest empire of all the European nations, and the third largest empire in Europe at that time. Also, they have a bellicose nature, even though we don't see it. They hide it. They have toned themselves down somewhat in the course of time. But they were once known for it. About 150 years ago, a lawyer in the USA, he said that when you see a Swede, someone from Sweden, with a knife scar on his face, he wasn't considered a real man. In other words, there's a point of honour with them, of fighting and being able to fight. Also, Roman Romance, in an article, Swedish Personality Traits and Character, says that Swedes have positive traits. They are very athletic and hardy. The Swedes are very athletic and hardy. They are strong people. They are healthy people. They are athletic people. They are also very punctual, and they have everything exactly set. And so too the quality of bravery and also volunteerism, volunteering for things to help the community. This is also found in the sense of the public responsibility that we find amongst the Swedish people. Another article by Chris Ebert, he says that Swedes act for the common good and try to minimize collateral damage to a unique extent. So it might be hard to notice that Swedes are actually extremely individualistic, like Americans, but you will never guess it. This is because Americans are competitive-minded, Swedes are cooperative-minded. They are cooperative-minded. This is why Swedish companies often outperform similar companies from other countries. Individual brilliance, the brilliance of individuals would be worked into the cooperative mesh to a common good. They give what they have to others, and they allow others to express themselves through them. This is an attribute of the Sweden, and this is something that Gad had, and we'll see more of this later. Another article also says that people working together, one of the characteristics of Sweden is that the people working together of their own free will. They have this voluntarism, this voluntary quality. They also have, the Swedes have a concern for women and children, so do the people of Gad. We saw when they said they would go with us to help conquer the areas west of the Jordan. But first of all, they would build fortresses for their women and children. And so they did. And incidentally, the ancient Scythians, of whom the Goths were a part, they also had a tradition that at one stage they had left their women and children behind in fortified areas, and then they'd gone forth to conquer other lands and return. And Jordanes, an historian, a nation historian, who was actually probably one of Gothic descent, or at least in part, and he wrote that the Goths had a tradition that they too had done the same. They had left their families, wives and children in certain areas and gone off to conquer. And this might relate something to what the tribe of Gad had done when they came in to conquer the land of Israel. And so this also, what they did, indicates a concern for women and children. This is a high priority in Swedish culture. Chris Ebert again says concerning the characteristics of the Swedes. He says in Sweden, there's a strong sense of community concerning for the community and helping fellow neighbours is strongly valued. Swedes generally care about the well-being of their society, and everyone is ensured to have the same access to healthcare, education, etc. Children are ensured to be safe and taken care of, and the elderly are ensured of having health insurance and retirement. People don't really have to worry about paying off medical bills or easily losing their job. And also he says in another article, also by Chris Ebert, he says, keep machismo at bay when dealing with the Swedish people. Sweden is the world's most feminine country. Chauvinism rarely fosters long-term success. Swedes are concerned for the rights of women. So, there may be, recently, it was published that a good portion, a fantastically high portion of Swedish women are raped or victims of rape, perhaps up to 1/4. So the immigrants are blamed for some of it, the Muslim immigrants. Sweden has 10 million inhabitants, 2 million of them are immigrants, mainly from Muslim countries, and they cause a lot of the crime and trouble. But another factor is that in Sweden there's a feministic policies, feministic orientation, concern for women, and they have a very broad interpretations of what rape is, and they are very considerate of women, allow women to complain and listen to their complaints and deal with them, so that a lot of women who are attacked, God forbid, find it much easier in Sweden to come forward and complain and to give details of what happened to them than in other countries. That is why there's, according to the Swedes at least, that's one of the reasons why the statistics for high incidence of rape in Sweden are much higher than elsewhere. We have another rabbinical source, Kalevi Shachen. It is a collection of articles, and in that they quote the Ramban and Nachmanides, saying that Gad took all the border areas of many cities since he was more of a warrior. Also the Safona, a commentary of the Safona, says that Gad was like a lion and therefore received a large expanse. The Kleyerka, another commentary, says that Gad volunteered to fight more than he had to. Gad did more than he had to do. Gad was a warrior, and Gad received a large territory, or took a large territory for himself, consequently. And this ties in with the Goths and Swedes, who were once warriors, and all in history we had the large-scale conquests of the Goths and later of the Swedes, as we have seen. Other rabbinical sources that are Rabbi David and Nahum Goldstoff, and he says that Gad had self-control. He said that Gad was together with Reuben and Simeon in the south in the encampment around the tabernacle. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, they wandered through the wilderness and they built a tabernacle, quite a portable temple. One could say they built this, and then they used to camp around it. And Gad was in the south together with Reuben and Simeon. Reuben was the head of the trio in the south, together with Gad and Simeon. And this section, according to this source, was marked by the attribute of repentance, of repenting for one's sins. That Gad was also noted for his gevura, his heroism, his warriorship, his warlike character and ability, and also Simeon was also noted for atonement, and Reuben was noted for repentance, and in general repentance was the major theme of this section in the south. In other words, Gad repents, he regrets what he has done in the past. This is an attribute of the Swedes and of everyone that is worth noting. And also he says that Gad was able to control his lusts. Gad was able to control his lusts, his sexual proclivities, his sexual yearnings. He was able to control himself in this matter. And the Swedes today are promiscuous. They are very promiscuous, according to our standards at least, also according to biblical standards. But the men do have self-control. The men do have self-control. When they want to hold themselves back, they can do so. And in other matters, they do control themselves. An article by Yair, what are unique traits of Swedish culture by Yair on Hora. He gives one of the traits of the Swedes. He says they have the trait of calmness. They are calm and practicality. Being very calm, relaxed, and down to earth is something that Swedes generally value and take to heart. Should always stay calm and not show any strong extreme emotions. Swedes would rarely yell or scream whenever they would feel anger or any other strong emotion. And they wouldn't find reasons to go insane. In Sweden, there's nothing really to go insane about. So Swedes control themselves and they are calm people. Another article by Christine Demsteder says that Swedes don't have a very compulsive culture. You see that in everyday life today. So Swedes control themselves, they are restrained. And this was one of the attributes of Gad, according to this source. And also other points by Christine Demsteder says that Swedes have a prohibition of bragging. It is absolutely forbidden to speak or think too good of yourself. We don't want to be criticized. We want people to think we're absolutely brilliant. And so on. Another rabbinical source, Rabbi Zvi Ratzman, he mentions concerning Gad that Gad had the attribute to expand his borders, expand his territories, as we saw. And this is also hinted at in the biblical blessing. In Deuteronomy 33:20, Moses says, "Blessed is he who enlarges Gad." In other words, Gad would be enlarged. He is blessing God for enabling Gad to do so. But this is an attribute of Gad. This was an attribute of the ancient Swedes and of the Goths before them. Another rabbinical source is that of Rabbi Chaim ben Sinio. He says that Gad became a warrior by virtue of wearing tefillin. Religious Jews wear tefillin. This is in the Bible. It says in Exodus 13:16. Shall be a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So this is something that religious Jews do. Tefillin, sometimes translated as phylacteries in the English Bible, tefillin, that is what religious Jews wear. They are actually quite expensive. They can cost a large sum of money, like $500 or something. That's nothing for a good set of tefillin. This is what you pay. You can also get cheaper versions, as long as they're kosher, use them. And this commandment only applies to the people under the law, that is the Jewish people in our time. But all of this, Gad was used to also, before they were exiled and they were considered as under the law. After they were exiled, they were no longer part of the legally obligated community, as explained elsewhere. They're no longer under the law. Their spiritual obligations, as if to say, were suspended until the future. So they no longer have to keep all of the commandments. But that is another point. At all events, when they were under the law, when they did keep the commandments, they were very strict about the mitzvah of tefillin. And by virtue of this, they were unable to cleave the head and the arm of their enemies at one blow. Because the head and the arm are the places where the tefillin are placed.